Thank you all for joining us for live Q&A with Professor Deen Freelon. This session is a follow-up to Dr. Freelon's video lecture, Analyzing Social Media from a User Eye View with PyGraph, that you've already watched. I'm proud to introduce one of our SICSS-Howard Mathematica alums who will introduce our speaker. Take it away, Nayanthara.
Thanks, Nanette. My name is Nayanthara Biswas, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Economics at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. My research lies in applied microeconomics, particularly in the fields of health, labor, and gender economics in low and middle-income countries. In my dissertation, I measure the impact of community health workers on maternal and child health and labor outcomes in India. I am also a SICSS-Howard Mathematica 2022 alum, and I am honored to introduce our guest, Professor Deen Freelon. Deen Freelon is an associate professor at the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina, and a principal researcher at the Center for Information, Technology, and Public Life. His theoretical interests address how ordinary citizens use social media and other digital communication technologies for political purposes, paying particular attention to how identity characteristics such as race, gender, ideology influence these uses. Methodologically, he is interested in how computational research techniques can be used to answer some of the most fundamental questions of communication science. Freelon has worked in the forefront of political communication and computational social science for over a decade, co-authoring some of the first communication studies to apply computational methods to social media data. Computer programming lies at the heart of his research practice, which generates novel tools and sometimes methods to answer questions existing approaches cannot address. He developed his first research tool, Recal, as part of his master's thesis, and it has since been used by tens of thousands of researchers worldwide. His scholarship has been financially supported by grant makers, including the US Institute of Peace, the Spencer Foundation, the Knight Foundation, and the Hewlett Foundation, and published in top-tier journals including Nature, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Freelon earned his Ph.D. from the University of Washington in 2012 and formerly taught at American University in Washington, D.C. Hi, Deen. It's really nice to meet you today and to discuss, your work. And the first question that I have is about your work. So what have you studied in the past, and what are projects that are currently in your pipeline that you're really excited about?
Well, I've studied a number of different social and political phenomena in the past. So I like to think of myself as someone who studies how people use the internet for politics. And so over my career, I started with studying youth civic engagement because that was what my advisor was studying. And I worked on research projects as a research assistant, as many, PhD students do. I moved on to study the Arab Spring and many Middle Eastern, North African uses of political social media that were sort of very salient in that area at that time. This is, 2010, 2011, 2012, and a little bit after that. And I had some colleagues that were funding me through a grant that they'd gotten, or a series of grants actually that they'd gotten. And so I did that work for a few years. Did some work on Black Lives Matter when that really became a major social movement in 2014, and did a few studies on that. And recently, I've been interested in a lot of the research that has emerged from the misinformation, disinformation cluster of work that's interdisciplinary. So a number of people who do that kind of work are in my field, communication. Some people are in political science. Some people are in information science. a few other fields that have sort of gotten in on this. It's a real growth area, a lot of money in the area. So, I'm as much of a bandwagon chaser as anybody. I tend to go where there is some degree of synergy between my interests and, fundable research. I mean, obviously, I don't completely chase the money because there are some things that are being well funded that I don't have any expertise in, but where I can find that synergy, I do try to chase it. And so, right now I'm really interested in questions of information quality and how people are exposed to and interact with content that is of both high and low quality, how that changes and how that relates to identity-based features of people's identities, such as race, gender, ideology, LGBTQ status, and things of that nature. And so I try to integrate those aspects into my research as much as I can. My perspective is that I don't really like to study, like race, quote unquote, or gender, quote unquote. For me, these are elements to be integrated into research, at a fundamental level, and not their own kind of topic that's over here. It's whatever you're studying. There is a race aspect, there's a gender aspect, there is a, sexual identity aspect. I try to bring those out in whatever the main topic it is that I'm studying.
Thank you for that, Dean. That was fascinating. So I want to talk now a little bit about your path to the professoriate. And particularly, I want to ask you, how did you know that you wanted to live a life of the mind? Or in other words, when did you know what you wanted to study?
Well, it's funny. When I was in high school, I remember having a specific thought in my head that I wanted to be, and this is the exact quote as it came through my mind, I wanted to be a minor intellectual. I don't know why I aspired to being minor, but, I don't think I knew at the time that I wanted to be a professor specifically. I guess at that time, I didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about my professional future. And that trend continued into my college years and afterward. There was a while during which I didn't really know what I wanted to be. And so immediately after college, I was a technology trainer and multimedia lab supervisor for Duke University for about 4 years. And during that time, I got a chance to meet a number of graduate students and professors who were doing work in different areas. I got a chance to learn a little bit about what they did and how they spent their time. And at the same time, I was spending a lot of time reading, I guess, what you would consider like pop social science books, like Freakonomics and, The Tipping Point and things like that. And that really got me interested in some of the underlying social science behind a lot of those books. Now, I was a psychology major when I was an undergraduate. I did a senior thesis. And, that gave me my first exposure to research. But when I was done with that, I wasn't super interested in it. I was like, well, this is all right, but I don't know if I want to do it. And so for a living. And so I took some time to, work and to have a job that had boundaries, in terms of, you stop at 5 o'clock and you go home and you do whatever else you want to do. And I actually had an old-fashioned epiphany. I still remember when it was. It was in February of 2005. And I was lying in my bed and I thought, wow, I could really be a professor and sort of teach about this and do research and things like that. But what's really funny is at the time, I don't think I fully understood like what being a professor entailed. A lot of people in this business have parents and other people that they know who are professors, and they're able to see what that's like up close. That was not me. I think that I saw people being professors standing up on stage, being quoted on the radio and on TV and stuff, and thinking that was kind of cool, but not really understanding what was behind it. And so when I went to grad school to start my master's in 2006 at the University of Washington, it was in some sense really just serendipity that it turned out that my personal, personality characteristics happened to gel with what the substance of being a grad student and later on a professor really were. And so that was just, I didn't know going into it. It was really just kind of luck. I was interested in the topic, but as any grad student or professor knows, you need a lot more than just interest to do this job. So, but I was fortunate because the skills that I had and the interest in terms of the way that I spent my time were really a good fit for this job.
Thank you. That was a wonderful answer. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on what you were talking about in terms of, having boundaries for this particular job, and what type of advice would you offer to others who are considering this path?
Let's see, boundaries. I think the best professors probably have weaker boundaries than a lot of people. This is not really the kind of job that rewards, going off and not paying attention to your email for extended periods of time, or just turning it off. I have some colleagues that have much harder boundaries than I do, but I just keep thinking, what if a really great opportunity comes through and you don't hear about it for weeks, and by the time you actually do hear about it, it's gone to somebody else because you weren't, paying attention. That's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. And so so you have that aspect, but also the fact that like having really hard boundaries is not really something that is not really a big value for me. So I'm totally fine having, not very strong boundaries as far as my work life goes. And so maybe I shouldn't say that out loud, but it's true. I'm pretty good with email. If you email me twice, normally once is fine, but if I don't get back to you the first time, email me again. Still might not get back to you, but it raises the probability, obviously. And so, but again, I'm speaking only for myself. And so if other people have really hard boundaries, that's great, and it works for them, cool. Having relatively weak work boundaries works pretty well for me. And so I find it hard to give general advice in this area, only because everybody has to make their job work for them, regardless of what it is, whether you're a professor or, a lawyer or a doctor or whatever. I think my sort of very high level advice is to try to, exploit those areas of flexibility, of malleability in your job to make it fit your personality and preferences as much as possible, and understand that there's more than one way of doing pretty much everything, and understand that you don't have to do it the exact way that your advisor did it or the way that your friends are doing it, and just figure out what works for you, really.
No, I completely relate to that, because I feel like a lot of academics do respond to emails even at 2 a.m. But now I want to move a little bit to kind of looking at, graduate students and their careers. So you describe yourself as a self-taught coder. How much would you emphasize and encourage students from non-technical backgrounds to pick up this skill and apply it to their personal research projects, in terms of coding, as well as in terms of, research management and project management?
Oh, well, I have two different answers to those two questions. I think research and project management is something every academic needs to be able to figure out how to do, because you got to get your work done. So got to figure out how to manage your projects, right? If you've been in grad school or just the general work environment, we all know people who are real good at starting things, but not so great at finishing things. And you definitely don't want to be that kind of person. So I definitely would say that you need to figure out ways of managing projects that are likely to lead to the fruition of those projects. And that there's not one way to do that. So you figure out a way that works for you, and a way that is or can be collaborative with other people if you do collaborative work. And if you do work by yourself, then ways that are self-motivated and proven, to lead to the desired result, which is a finished product and a published product. So yeah, I think project management skills, time management skills are going to be required pretty much for any academic. I mean, honestly, for any kind of project-based work, which is like most interesting work that you could possibly do. And then in terms of coding, I would say that coding is good for certain types of research. If you're a qualitative researcher and you're interviewing people or doing ethnography or whatever it is, you might not need it. If you are doing, what I would say is that if you are conducting research on data sets that are digital in any way, so in other words, they're natively digital or they've been digitized, and there's a lot of it, then coding is going to help you. So any kind of social media work, any kind of work on, large volumes of text from books, transcripts of anything, large amount of images, video, audio, any of this stuff, you're going to find a really good space for coding, doing that kind of research. And so I would be the last person to say that this is for everybody, but I think that as increasing amounts of our culture become digitized and become available in very large quantities, I think that the importance of coding and computational research more generally will only continue to increase.
So related to that, what kind of sources would you recommend for graduate students to kind of pick up coding, maybe on software such as R and such? And also, could you tell us more about how you would manage your own projects which are in the pipeline? Like, do you have a kind of a spreadsheet for that? Do you have a Dropbox or something like that?
Okay, so one, how should people learn to code? And secondly, how do I manage my own projects? Those are two separate questions. So let me, I guess, go in order. How should we learn how to code? I don't know. I mean, as my Twitter bio says, I'm self-taught, and that worked great for me. I've only taken one actual computer science class, and that was in 1998. It was Computer Science 106A at Stanford University, and I earned a B in that class. And the reason I didn't go any further is because there were, Stanford is one of the greatest computer science departments in the world, and there were a lot of people in my class who were coding rings around me who had never coded before. And the message that I took from that was, well, if I'm not as instantly good at this as the people around me, then why should I even bother, proceeding? And so I ended up doing some other things. But I realized that I just needed a shift in perspective. In that class, they had us, the final project in that class, that CS 106 class at Stanford, was to recreate Microsoft Paint in C. And, that was very boring for me. And I didn't find that to be like a good or, interesting or worthwhile use of my time. And so that wasn't very motivating for me to do that kind of work. And so I said, well, this is kind of boring. I don't want to do this. I'm more interested in people and social science and things like that. And so it wasn't until years later that I realized that I could use code to do some of the things that I really wanted to do. So the first thing that I ended up writing any useful code for outside of that class, which was when I was doing training sessions for technology at Duke, I modified an existing PHP script whose purpose was to enroll people in these courses. And so the script already existed. So I modified it and I put new little features on it. Like I put a little reminder on it and a couple of things where you could log back in and see which sessions you were enrolled in. So, that was interesting and useful to me because it helped me do my job better. And so that really continued when I became a professor. And I figured, I came in 2006. At that time, people in the social sciences, at least in the communication, were not talking about computational research the way that they are now. And so it was really just serendipitous that I happened to come into grad school at a time that my skills were becoming highly useful. And I became somebody in my field who became a real evangelist for these kinds of tools and these kinds of skills. Now, again, I think I'm really hitting on a theme here. I think that learning computational research effectively is greatly facilitated by understanding how you learn best. And so for me, what worked really well was being very self-motivated. So for me, like I always like to say, it's an old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. So what that means is that I don't understand something till I need to use it. Like for years, I didn't understand how recursion worked until I needed to use it. And I was like, oh, now I know recursion, right? So like there's something in my brain that doesn't click until I need to use something as a means to an end. And then that just makes understanding it super easy for me. But if I don't have that end, then I look at it, it's like I'm looking at a totally different language I don't understand. So that's the way my brain works. I can't just learn. I find it difficult to like learn something just for the sake of like for abstract purposes. It's got to be some kind of reason why I'm learning it, some kind of goal that I'm trying to get at. And that makes learning the underlying concept way easier for me. But that's just me. A lot of people in that class at Stanford, they were motivated just to learn C, in and of itself, and I wasn't. And so understanding what really motivates you and why you want to do this is critical to determining whether you can be internally motivated to learn this on your own by looking through Stack Overflow and doing courses on Coursera and LinkedIn Learning and that kind of stuff, or whether you want to take actual classes taught by professors, or however you want to do it, learn from books, whatever, understand how you operate and then act accordingly. So that's my answer to the first. Second question is, how do I manage my own projects? I don't know. I mean, I have folders on my Dropbox. I have like a little research folder that is different subfolders for my different projects. And I have like Microsoft sticky notes where I have my different projects on my desktop that I look at. And normally I think about my projects, interestingly enough, I think of my projects in terms of calendar years, not academic years. So at the very beginning of every calendar year, I'm like, here are the projects that I really want to get done for this year. And that's really, I don't really hold myself to that super strongly. It's just to sort of structure my thinking about, okay, here are the projects I want to do. And by the end of the year, I want all these submitted. Here are my conference deadlines. Here are the ones I'm going to shoot for. But I change it up all the time because stuff comes up. People ask me, they're like, hey, do you want to do this project, that project? A lot of times I say no. Sometimes I say yes. And so I like to include a little bit of slack in my schedule so that I can say yes to really cool stuff that just pops up. And then if it's something really fun and something I'm really interested in, something a colleague I really want to work with comes to me with, then I like to be able to say yes to those kinds of things. I don't like to schedule something, my entire year so tightly that I don't have any space for that. So that's one thing that I find really important, is to be able to have the slack in my schedule to say yes to things that are really useful and for studying things that just come up and that need a rapid response. So that's, I guess, the short version of how I do it. But again, so I sound like a broken record here. Everybody's got to do what works for them. Don't copy me, because you can copy me and then it not work for you. Then you'd be like, Dr. Freelon, why are you telling me to do this or that? I didn't tell you to do anything. I told you to do what works for you. So, do that.
On that note, let's jump into the context of your presentation in terms of the current project that you're working on. Mm-hmm. So for researchers like you who are currently grappling with this idea of echo chambers in social media, how did you start thinking about it?
How do I start? Well, I mean, I normally start thinking about most things by relying on the literature. So you go back and read, like, what are people talking about, right? Because it's very difficult to publish anything in most fields if you're not entering an already ongoing conversation. So the idea of echo chambers goes back a couple of decades, really, maybe a bit before that, but not that far. And so it's been an ongoing conversation since before I started graduate school. So I looked at that and thought, okay, well, how can I contribute to this? How can I advance this conversation? And one of the things I arrived at was that the idea of the echo chamber is something that really puts the theoretical cart before the horse. And the question you're asking with that kind of research in many cases is such and such online environment an echo chamber? But that's a pretty narrow question to ask, because there are a lot of other things it could be in addition to being an echo chamber. A lot of research is like this. So the research that I did before looking at echo chambers considered, was a sort of a question that I think is not as popular now as it used to be, because it's sort of been definitively answered, in my opinion, which is you look at online conversation and you try to figure out how like deliberative it is, or how much it fits into traditional normative conceptions of quote unquote good or high quality political speech. Spoiler alert, not a whole lot of that on the internet, although there is some. But what happens is a lot of the research in that area sort of followed a very similar path, which is you look at it and you find out there's not a whole lot of deliberation. It's like, okay, great. Well, it invites the question of, well, if it's not deliberative, then what is it? Same thing with echo chambers. We found that people don't typically tend to inhabit what was originally hypothesized to be echo chambers. And so the question is, well, what is there, right? And so a lot of my research tries to, or the project that I presented on, tries to answer that question. Well, if it's not an echo chamber, then what is it? How can we characterize this theoretically and conceptually without trying to investigate this narrow question of whether or not this is an echo chamber and characterize it in terms of what it is, rather than what it is not.
Related to this, what, according to you, are the implications of the concept of ideological congeniality of social media content being misused by political and/or social actors on maybe impressionable users?
You said ideological congeniality of social media content?
Yes, that's
Okay.
right.
Okay, well, that is not a concept. I'm not familiar with that specific term, but based on what you have said, I mean, I guess that could be a way of saying that it is content that people like, right, politically. So content that reinforces their pre-existing beliefs. I mean, what do I think about that? I don't know. It's got a good, it's a double-edged sword. It's got good aspects and bad aspects. I mean, if you look at my social media feed personally, I think a lot of that content is going to reinforce my political beliefs. I don't think that's bad necessarily. I think the sort of less salubrious aspects of that come in when people's desires to have their pre-existing beliefs reinforced leads them to believe things that are not true, or secondly, and probably more insidiously, leads them to dismiss evidence that is true, but that goes against their pre-existing beliefs. And that's one thing that I've really tried to struggle against on a personal level. And so that's a nice, in other words, intersection between my personal interest and what I think is important to do as like a citizen and a human being with my professional research in terms of what I study. And so a couple of weeks ago, I posted a Twitter thread and I said, okay, well, it seems like this is sort of a very general summary of it, but I said, it seems like everybody wants somebody else to change their opinions and confront their own confirmation bias and their own cognitive dissonance and all this stuff, but they don't want to do it themselves. They think it's somebody else's problem. So what I'm saying is, why don't you, as an individual, tell me about some specific areas where you have changed your mind, where you've encountered information or facts that have gone against your own pre-existing beliefs, and rather than trying to dismiss them and be identity protective and cognition protective, when have you actually changed your mind on something that was very close to your own self-concept or your deeply held beliefs? And so people actually reacted with some interesting stories about things that they believed previously, what it took, how long it took, the ways that they resisted. I gave a couple stories from my own life. And so I think that that's something that really demonstrates the double-edged sword of content that reinforces people's pre-existing beliefs. I think that, having deeply held values is really important, but I also think it's important to continually reevaluate your beliefs and to be reality-based. So, a good example of this personally is when I'm out in public around people I don't know, I typically wear a mask. Do I love wearing a mask? No. But like science says the pandemic's not over, I'm at risk, right? Racial minorities are at risk. People over 40 are at risk. And, I want to be here for my kids in 20, 30 years. So I'm not running around like the pandemic's over. And, I'm not telling other people what to do. That's just my own personal decision, my own personal desire to live life in a fact-based way. And so that, I think, again, I'm going a little bit off on a personal tangent, but I think that demonstrates how I personally approach the question of different content that may pose some challenges for what I wish was true versus living life, in accordance with what is true, as science can best determine.
So related to that, I want to ask you, how do you approach social media, and how do you advise your family, your friends, your children, to be on certain kinds of platforms versus not to be on other platforms?
Well, my kids are 4 and 7, so not really on social media yet. That's something that I've talked with a little bit with my wife. I think it'll probably sneak up on us faster than we expect. But my family, I think some people's families have a little bit more trouble with this than others. I think that people at least in the United States, who have had a long period of time or for a long time haven't really been challenged by the realities of the present and past of this country, I think are having a lot more trouble in this moment than people who have felt the brunt of history a bit more closely, as it were. So, I don't have anybody in my family who's, coming around talking about, vaccines have microchips in them. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, you can just smoke some marijuana and then it'll be fine. Really crazy stuff like that is not something that I've really had to deal with, which is good. And so I've been lucky, I think, in that way, to not have to have, deep heart-to-hearts with my family members talking about, you can't be spreading all of this anti-vax stuff or all of this, big lie stuff, because there's no truth to it. What I have said to people who do have folks like this in their family, or that they're friends with people like this, is that this is serious. And the kinds of lies that are currently being spread, claims without scientific or political or factual basis, can result in people being hurt or killed, people being disenfranchised, people reacting in ways that alienate individuals and that cause other kinds of problems. And so this is not innocent. And so people need to understand that. And, it takes time. I always say that, trying to fight with people on social media about these kinds of things is not especially effective if you are on the perceived other side of the political aisle as them. So in other words, I can, scream digitally till I'm blue in the face at a conservative. They're not going to listen to me because I'm not part of their in-group. And so it's one of these situations where change has to come from within. So if you are on the conservative side of the aisle and you believe all sorts of things that are demonstrably false, odds are it's going to need to be another conservative that convinces you that it's false and that it's a bad idea from your political perspective to pursue these kinds of things that are false. There's not a whole lot I can do. Now, if there are people on the, on the left side, progressive side, whatever you want to call it, that believe false things, then I'm going to stand a much greater chance of changing their minds. But, a lot of this, we are, human beings are sort of very collectively oriented people. And so you've got to you got to work on your own house and clean up, the situations that have been created by people that are in your in-group. And there's not a whole lot, I can, you lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I can tell you what the truth is, but, unless you're in my in-group, odds are just, so psychologically, like, odds are you're not going to listen to me. So that's really what I say is, you got to start with your own in-group, start with your own family, start with people who love you, who you love. And that's where you're really going to stand the greatest chance of changing some minds.
So now I want to ask you, going from your personal life, were you surprised in your study when you found that users who believed in the pandemic had a lower mean fact quality, whereas the big lie didn't have the same effect, since both might be coming from the same types of maybe right-leaning users?
Yeah, I think what that really shows is that not all conspiracy theories are created equal. Okay. So, there's also been in the literature a pretty big disconnect between the number of people who express belief in particular conspiracy theories and the actual content of the media that they find that is found in their personalized information environments. So that's something that we find, that's consistent with existing literature. And it's something that we need to tease out. Because a lot of times, even when it comes to mainstream media, these things are discussed. Big Lie is a great example. Some of the COVID conspiracies are great examples of this, people who don't believe in the vaccine, et cetera. Whenever you have elected officials who talk about this, then it becomes news. And so it's not like, so if you look at the methods that we have, we're looking at content where people are making money off of mis and disinformation. But those aren't the only sources that push this stuff out. So even, if a Washington Post or a New York Times will talk about somebody who's a vaccine denier or elected official who is spewing disinformation about this content, and they label it as such, it's still getting spread out there. And so people may consume this with the view that, you know, the people that the New York Times and other traditional journalistic outlets are saying is false. The people that are looking at this may say, well, actually, it's these quote unquote traditional mainstream sources that are the quote unquote fake news. And the truth tellers, you know, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or whoever else, you know, who those of us who are science-based understand to be spreading content that's false. But in the eyes of their followers, they believe it's true. And so, in other words, they view these mainstream sources, or they may view, this is a possibility, they may view these mainstream sources with the level of skepticism that we view the content that our team has labeled as low quality. And so that's a possibility. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it certainly is something that's worth exploring. And I think also that we might want to look at, so in the study, we didn't look at the actual content of what people were spreading. We looked only at the domains and classified those as high or low quality. So it may very well be that certain content is more prevalent among these low quality domains, and that is linked to the propensity of the people in our study to embrace this or that conspiracy theory. So a lot to unpack there, but it certainly doesn't surprise me that certain conspiracy theories might be more closely linked with the low quality sites in our sample than others.
I now want to invite Edith to ask a question.
My name is Edith, and I'm a senior student at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm major in economics and minor in computer science. So my question today would be, what's the future of social media given the recent policy changes in Twitter and TikTok?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, so the policy changes that you're talking about, one, you want to talk about Twitter. So just last week, Twitter introduced changes to its data collection rules that drastically increased the price from $0 for academics to $100 a month for 10,000 tweets, which, if you do the math, is 1 cent per tweet, which honestly is a lot of money for data. And then, but that's not even that much data. And the next step up moves you into the mid 5 figures, which is far beyond the price range of most academics that I know. And so that's going to make collecting Twitter data very difficult for research going forward. My hope is that Twitter will be able to work something out that is cost effective for academic purposes. And they made a reference that they would do this, but that was, who knows when that's going to happen. And so I think that researchers are just going to have to wait and see what Twitter's offerings for academics are going to be specifically. And in the meantime, they can take advantage of certain techniques that are unauthorized by Twitter that will allow them to collect data from the service without recourse to the official APIs. Now, such methods can be shut down by Twitter on a technical level at any time. And so they're quite contingent upon the implementation of technical countermeasures. But at this point, aside from the newly and prohibitively costly options for the API, those non-sanctioned methods are more or less the only game in town for collecting Twitter data. Now, in reference to TikTok, TikTok has actually gone in the opposite direction in offering academics the ability to apply for access to the TikTok's new Read API that allows for the downloading of data about videos and comments on videos. Now, to get this, this is actually very similar to what Twitter offered before, Musk takeover. And so you've got to fill out an application, tell them how you're going to use it, and then theoretically they'll give you access if they don't have any objection to the kind of research that you're trying to conduct. But TikTok does something that Twitter, I think, asked about, but I think TikTok goes a little bit further because they are requiring researchers to basically match their own local databases against the TikTok API on roughly a bi-weekly basis. And so it's about every 15 days, they want you to sort of computationally compare what you've got on your end to what they have on their end, and then delete anything that has been removed from the TikTok end from your end. Now, as a technical matter, that is very difficult to do. And it's something that I think could be quite prohibitive, especially for people who are starting up, and even for people who think they know what they're doing. It's a fault, it's a fault-prone system, right? That could go wrong. That could go wrong for any number of reasons. And also, it doesn't really have any sort of time limits on it. I suppose the time limit is that when your research is done, you're supposed to delete the data, which of course causes problems for reproducibility, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of issues there. I think it'll be interesting to see just how serious TikTok is about enforcing that particular provision of its terms of service. That remains to be seen. The TikTok API is very new. It came out, within the last couple of months. And so I'll be watching that very closely to see whether that actually presents any practical barriers to research. And so that's kind of a short version.
I will now invite Jasmine Aurora to ask a question.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Aurora, and I'm a fourth year at UC Berkeley majoring in data science. And my question is, how else can you analyze exposure to low quality information other than using web domains?
That's a real good question. The domain method is one that has been used in a variety of studies. And the reason it's so popular is because it's easy to use, and it affords a high economy of the empirical data, and the way that it's used is really it's a really good method to use. And so I probably should be more specific there. Basically, links are kind of the lifeblood of social media in many ways, right? And so if you look at social media feeds, you look at the links that are posted, it's quite easy to take a look at a domain and say, this domain on the whole is dedicated toward the production of truth, empirically verified, scientifically verified facts, and on the other hand, falsehoods that are calculated to reinforce people's pre-existing political beliefs. So again, you get a lot of mileage out of that particular method. Now, what are other ways of doing this? One of the suggestions that is often put to me when I talk about this work is to look not at the domain, but at specific articles. The problem there is it is incredibly resource intensive to try to determine the fact quality of a particular article. Now, you could try to do this. Someone suggested this at a recent presentation that I made. They suggested using, AI or ChatGPT or something to try to do that on an article by article basis. And what I said was, great, just validate it. I say that I use that phrase a lot. Great, just validate it. So what that means is that you could do it, but the question is, can you do it to the same degree of quality that a human would do it? And for something like AI, the validation process would not be that complicated. You just have a bunch of articles, 500 something articles, have humans rate the fact quality on one end, let the computer do it on the other, and then compare the results, see how well the computer did, using human judgment as a baseline. And so maybe in the future, this is something that we'll be able to do. I haven't seen a paper to do this yet. And so that's something that I think is could be, really effective in terms of doing it. Other research has looked at the fact quality judgments of specific articles that come from sites like Snopes and PolitiFact. The problem there is there's a selection issue because, first of all, they've got a limited staff, so they can't fact check everything. But even if they had, as large of a staff as they possibly, could have, you're only going to get content on the low quality end, and you don't get content on the high quality end. Because just because something is not outright false doesn't mean it's the highest quality that it could be. It doesn't mean that it's incorporating all the perspectives that it perhaps should. Everything could be technically correct, but it could still leave a false impression. And so that, again, is another method I think is good in certain areas, but just due to the limitations of manpower and things of that nature, is going to fall short for other perspectives. One thing that we've proposed to do is this is entirely theoretical at this point because we haven't finished our empirical work on this yet. But one thing that we want to do in our research group is to try to figure out whether there are a certain class of object, for lack of a better term, that we call disinformation attractors. And so these are people, places, things, ideas, institutions that tend to generate a lot of mis and disinformation about them. So examples would be George Soros, Bill Gates, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, right? These are, among other things, individuals, Wuhan, China, right? These are individuals and places about which there tends to be a lot of disinformation. And so if we can figure out empirically who these disinformation attractors are, we could also try to figure out whether these are objects that are discussed predominantly by individuals and platforms whose main job it is to produce disinformation. So in other words, if there's an individual who's exclusively or overwhelmingly discussed by low quality platforms and sites, then it stands to reason that whenever you see this individual being discussed, it's probably going to be a low quality discussion. Conversely, if there are certain other objects that are exclusively or overwhelmingly discussed by high quality sites, then whenever you see conversation about that object, odds are it's going to be a high quality discussion. And so reorienting the research around not domains, but around the objects or entities that may attract, or I guess the opposite of that would be to deflect disinformation, can really help get around some of those methodological challenges and limitations that the domain-based method presents.
Related to this, in your presentation, you had talked about, using user-based, user-centric data from services like Media Bias Fact Check and pre-tagging each of the sites. Now, in some of the cases, the contents of the websites are different in fact quality level, as you have said, and ideologies based on algorithm analysis on users' preferences, right? Like YouTube and TikTok and such. But how does one determine the fact quality of these websites as a researcher? And is it possible to pre-tag these websites?
I'm not 100% sure I understood the question. So as far as Media Bias Fact Check goes, so all of that content, in other words, so we outsource the decision or the classification in terms of fact quality to Media Bias Fact Check, because they've already done the work, and the work has been validated through a number of empirical studies that have used their classification system. And so generally speaking, I think that's a good idea because, they're the experts and their work has been shown to correlate highly with other fact quality classification schemes. And so generally speaking, I think that's a good way of going about things. Now, It does have some limitations, especially when you're talking about media sources that are not in English. And so I think that other languages are going to need to kind of do their own classification system that's very similar to media bias fact check. But I do think MBFC has a really good track record and high levels of coverage when it comes to US-centered English language political and news sites. And so I think that's a really good way to go. A number of sites, a number of research studies have done this. And yeah.
So now I want to turn to what might be next for you as a researcher and a scholar studying using data sets on user-centric views. How would you expect that computational social science can fit into this future work? And also, if our students wanted to work with you, how would they get in touch?
Well, I can start with the second one. I'm very easy to reach. You can find me on my faculty page. I have an email address right there. You can write to me and tell me what your ideas are. I mean, I don't always have time to respond. I have a lot of, obviously I have a lot going on, but I try to respond to students who have questions that have shown that they have thought a lot about what it is they're trying to study, and that shows that their research ideas are viable. And so again, it's aspirational, it's not perfect, but again, ideas, the worst, the worst that can happen is no response. So I would certainly recommend that. Now, as far as what's next for me, the data that we've created with the PyGraph project is incredibly rich and can be used to support a wide range of research studies, not just political ones. So really any research that is concerned with the kinds of content that people have opted into, the kind of content that they have told the system they're interested in seeing and interacting with, you could study using our data, because we have full tweet objects for all of the timelines for our users. And we have that data for almost a year, including the Elon Musk takeover. We've got really good amount of data before and after that. So anybody who's really interested in studying the impact of Elon Musk's takeover on people's individual timeline content can certainly do that with our data set. You could study anything from health content, religious content, entertainment, anything of this nature. It's all, we've got it all. And really, I think what this data set rewards is, inventiveness and ingenuity in terms of coming up with research designs that really exploit the power of this data set. So certainly I'm interested in having these kinds of conversations. Not everything is going to work and not everything is going to be a fit. So in particular, our data set would not be really good for trying to explore algorithmic manipulations, because that data are simply not included. But when you're interested in trying to explore the implications of people's choices in terms of what to receive, I think this would be a good data set for that.
Great, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for joining us, Professor Freelon, and thank you, Nayanthara, for moderating this session.
Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.